Welcome everyone to this event at the Tony Blair Institute. I'm Anton Spisak, I'm a policy lead for trade at the TBI. And the topic for today is perhaps one of the most central questions of Britain's future after Brexit. During Brexit negotiations, we heard a lot about the need to secure regulatory sovereignty from the EU and its benefits for the future. And the UK can now do things differently. It can change EU regulations it once didn't like. Domestic regulators have put new powers and responsibilities that were previously set by Brussels, and the UK is now an independent regulatory actor internationally. What this means for what the government wants to do with those new freedoms is less clear. How far and where exactly does the UK want to diverge from the EU? Where does it make sense to stay broadly in line? How do its ambitions interact with the obligations under the contentious Northern Ireland Protocol? And how does Britain want to position itself as an independent actor in a global regulatory sphere which is fiercely competitive? These are just some of the questions that we'll be discussing today. We at the TBI have this week published our own assessment of what the UK could do usefully in the future and how it could change its regulatory approach, but also some of the constraints that we are facing as we think through this massive task ahead. We have also argued that because Brexit brings about the biggest change to the UK's regulatory regime in a generation, we should use it as an opportunity to reflect on what kind of regulatory model we want in the years ahead. So I'm delighted that we have a fantastic panel today to discuss this massive question. We have George Freeman, who's an MP for Mid-Norfolk and has been an MP since 2010, held a number of cabinet roles. And George is currently a member of the Downing Street Taskforce on regulatory reform, which is in charge of advising the Prime Minister on future post-Brexit opportunities. We also have Cathryn, who is the chair of the Regulatory Horizons Council, an independent advisory body to the government, and also a director of regulatory affairs at Thames Water. We have Jill Rutter, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, and this week published another paper on managing regulatory divergence after Brexit. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Cathryn Barnard, who's a professor of EU law and labor law at Cambridge University. So let me turn to George Freeman first. George, you are obviously in the middle of it all. You are sitting on the Prime Minister's task force on regulatory reform. What have you recommended to the Prime Minister in your report without putting you on the spot first?
Well, thank you. Firstly, Anton, thanks to the Tony Blair Institute and for putting this together and bringing Jill and Cathryn and I together. There's been a flurry of brilliant work this week. The Institute for Government report, your report. Ian Martin had a good piece in the Times yesterday saying 6 years after he voted for Brexit, finally some work being done on what it might actually mean. So I think this is a really important conversation and I'm really thrilled to be joining you. Just to correct you, I'm actually the only MP for Mid-Norfolk and I haven't served in the cabinet. And I'm not today speaking, I'm not a minister, I'm not in the government. And the task force that the PM put together was very much a backbench task force. So let me just describe a little bit about that. I can't, good question though, I can't tell you exactly what's in it. It is not yet published, but it's been through the Cabinet Regulatory Committee and plans are afoot now to, I believe, to publish it and then to implement bits of it. Let me just set the scene. So, I mean, I come at this as somebody who elected 2010 after a 15-year career in technology, finance and venturing, and was in the coalition First Minister for Life Science. I campaigned for Remain, quite noisily actually, and as Minister for the UK life science sector, I was focused on launching UK genomics, helping the MHRA put in place parallel approvals, launching the early access to medicine scheme, setting a 10-year strategy for the life sciences. Little did I think that 10 years later, it would pay the dividends that it has. And I just mention that because it's a reminder that good long-term policy that doesn't fit neatly into the electoral cycles of Parliament, good long-term policy pays dividends if it's clear. And I should start by saying I agree with all 5 of your recommendations in your report. The need to be strategic about what regulatory approach we want to take, to really look at the UK's regulatory model properly, not just in isolation. Thirdly, to look at the European single market constructively and look at where we've got clear interest in a unified market and where we have interest in constructive divergence for the benefit of Europe as well. I'll touch on that. And fourthly, that our regulatory strategy must support our broader economic strategy, which needs to be clear. And that lastly, we need to look internationally. And I couldn't agree more with all of those. And the TIGGR report, I've tried to tackle those in it. So let me just reassure you, where I'm coming from on this is somebody who was worried on balance that Brexit would be a bigger distraction and cost to our economic recovery post-crash than a gain. But the people of Mid-Norfolk, having voted 62% for it, I am their representative, and we now have to make it work well. And it seems to me that there's little point going through all this agony if we're not going to deliver a real dividend, a real boost to UK competitiveness and international leadership. So I've come at this from the point of view of that perspective. And in fact, the Prime Minister wanted that. He wanted Ian Duncan Smith, who was a very loud campaigner for sovereignty and regulatory reform, and me as a former Remainer, but somebody who also wanted reform. And I published a report for the Fresh Start group warning the EU that the pace of science and technology, particularly in the biosciences, in life science, in clinical trials, in genomics, in informatics, in agri-tech, means we have to regulate faster. And if the EU wasn't careful, it's in danger of regulating us into slow lane globally, and that we've got to be more agile. So that's the background that I bring to it. Essentially, the report, we had 3 months to report. We held over 75 industry roundtables and with experts, and that was my, although we were backbenchers, I wanted us to take the opportunity to reach out to industry groups and academics, and we work closely with Cathryn and the Regulatory Horizons Council. And we've set out the report. I can tell you it's in 3 parts. The first looks at the strategic opportunity and sets out a philosophic basis for a post-EU UK regulatory framework, innovative regulation for UK innovation. And we argue that the UK has got an opportunity to really lead in agile, digital, smart, responsive regulation. In my last job, I was Minister for the Future of Transport and tried to suggest that instead of taking 10 years to decide whether we thought e-scooters were a good idea, we should put in place some absolute minimum safety standards, create some test beds in 5 cities, license them for testing use, collect data properly, and license on the basis of the evidence. And if they were to be sort of shown to be lethal in London and safe everywhere else, we should license on and regulate on that basis. So I think there's an opportunity for us to be much more agile. So that first section sets out the philosophy. And to me, it should be that we have to have a competitive advantage. We've just come out of the European single market. As somebody who had a career in business and in science and innovation, we better have a compelling proposition to make good that and give us a competitive advantage. And so that's what the first section deals with. Then secondly, we've identified 10 or 15, depending how you add them up, 10 sectors, specific sectors, where there are real opportunities today to unlock massive growth if we change the regulatory framework. Some of them are UK regulations that have been sort of, how can I put it, not focused on properly in the debate about EU regs. That some of them are UK regs, but some of them are very much linked to our freedom outside Europe. And then the third bit of the report looks at implementation. And this field, as Jill and others and Cathryn know, is littered with reports gathering dust. And our very strong steer is, if this is going to be done, or any of it is to be done, it will need strategic leadership from the top, and it'll need a proper framework for implementation. And that conversation is going on, as I understand it now, behind the scenes, but I'm not party to them as a backbencher. I'm simply waiting to hear what the Prime Minister makes of our report.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, George. And can I ask you one further question, which is about the spirit of this exercise? And there have been various signals coming from Whitehall in the last couple of weeks and months. David Frost, he was just before the European Scrutiny Committee a couple of weeks ago. He said that a lot of this is motivated by an attempt to try to deregulate some of the aspects of the UK economy. And he was quite explicit about that. Then there is another group of people involved in all of this who say this is really about looking at regulation differently. So what's your take about some of the, you talk about the principles, can you give us a sense of what are the, the fundamentals of this exercise you're going through?
Yeah, let me just first say, so the other co-chairs of the task force, Ian Duncan-Smith and Teresa Villiers, and we worked across different sectors. Ian led really on the city, a whole bunch of financial services reforms, MiFID II. I focus more on the scale-up finance and how we could unlock our pension system to support scale-up companies better in the UK. Teresa focused more on the environment, having been Environment Secretary, and some of the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, having been Northern Ireland Secretary. And I focused really on the areas that I've had a professional and ministerial career in, so the science and the technology sectors. Key point, I campaigned for convergence, for the carrying over of our environmental obligations on workers' rights and environmental standards, food standards. And absolute line one for me was, this is about honouring those commitments, but showing how we can go further and be bolder in giving the UK a regulatory competitive advantage. And to your question, Anton, there are two bits of that really. Some of that is about what I suppose you might call deregulation. So we've made some quite provocative, eye-catching, I hope, suggestions around how GDPR works. Now, somebody might want to describe that as dereg. We make a clear set of recommendations about how fit for purpose 21st century regulation of data privacy needs to be constructed around the interests of the citizen, the patient, the individual, and making sacrosanct their rights, and very substantial obligations on big tech companies who have an incredible privileged access, and that the state has a duty, but the duty shouldn't be misinterpreted as pretending that it owns all the data and is therefore unable to do anything with it, which is the muddle I think we're in danger of getting into. It needs a framework. Now, some might call that dereg. I would call it smart reg for proper data in the 21st century. I'll give you another example. If one looked, for example, at functional foods, nutraceuticals, this is an old chestnut of mine. So I was a director years ago of a seeds company, and I had a background in agri-tech. What do I mean by nutraceuticals? I mean those products that are foods that have a medical benefit. Now, we tend to regulate in very binary silos. That's a food, and the FSA regulate it, or it's a medicine, and the MHRA regulate it. And we've got a whole class of things coming through now that are very exciting. I'm particularly excited because many of them are developed in Norfolk at the brilliant Norwich Research Park, the John Innes Institute, 23,000 scientists. It's probably Europe's biggest integrated science park, food, medicine, energy. And we're developing products like the blight-resistant potato that doesn't need 14 applications of toxic fungicide. They're developing drought-resistant crops that could grow in Africa. They're developing crops like the Beneforte broccoli that has health-enhancing and health disease-preventing properties. This is amazing science with global application. And of course, off the back of the old GMO debate, we've moved on a long way from the 1.0 GMO of taking genes out of one organism and putting it in another. We're now talking about really subtle up and down modulating and regulating of existing genes in plants. This is great leadership. And the EU has got a pretty clunky ban, a GMO ban on all this. And we're suggesting that we should lean in and create a framework for nutraceuticals and functional foods with high quality regulation and embed those international standards around the world and seek to lead. And one of our arguments is that if we lead in the setting of good regulatory standards, we also will then attract investment in the UK. It's interesting to me that we're no longer a great shipbuilding nation, but we're still the maritime law and insurance and regulatory hub. And that goes back 200 years. And because we set, when we were the great shipping nation, we set a lot of the standards. The international maritime conferences are still in the UK. So there's a huge win for us in terms of setting international standards. And I'd like us to go further and embed those in our trade deals. Variable tariffs. I think it's criminal that we charge African farmers 40% tariff on food. but I'd like to suggest it's sort of basic tariff should be 5% or something, but 0% reserve for those who are growing at the most sustainable ways. And by the way, we'll help export our brilliant agri-tech and innovations to help them using our aid budget to help them grow sustainably. So if we get this right, I think there's a chance for us to use our regulatory freedom to drive UK innovation and help export it globally to help sustainable development.
Thank you, George. And I think it does resonate with one of our recommendations, which is that there are some opportunities for doing things differently when we are strategic about intervention, and especially when we choose technological niches where UK has existing global strengths and advantages. The slight tension, I suppose, in all of this is that on the one hand, there is that, opportunity, if you like, and on the other, the government has just scrapped the industrial strategy, which has been about trying to inject some thinking and strategy into the whole space. Would you agree with that? Or do you think there is still thinking and people inside government who are trying to do those things strategically?
Yeah, I don't think the government's just scrapped industrial strategy at all. It's been through various iterations and cycles. I was one of the noisy new generation Conservatives in 2010 arguing in the coalition that the 1980s days of sort of small state stepping back from any role were over. We need leadership in these new sectors. And of course, the truth is that we've been through 3 phases of industrial strategy, really. In the coalition, David Willits and I pushed a strategy based on sectors and real investment in science and both blue sky science, commercialization and adoption. David and I set out those 8 great technologies, and the life science strategy, the agri-tech strategy, both of which I led with him, were the first 2. Then under Theresa May, the emphasis shifted to place-based industrial strategy instead of sector-based. So there was a big focus on, which is perfectly legitimate, I think, that, a worry that industrial strategy shouldn't mean pumping more and more money into the Golden Triangle and leaving behind areas all around the country. Then I think through Brexit, the whole thing has just got rather lost, and there hasn't been a lot of coherent thinking about industrial strategy. And I think now you're seeing the government set out a 3rd phase, which is about net zero, about some very bold commitments to take COVID as a catalyst for healthier and cleaner growth, to embrace leadership in innovation and science. And actually, one of the points we make in the report is that if you're prepared to do that and use your regulatory freedom to strike a lead, to take a lead, you can then grow clusters around the country. And one of the exciting things about the aerospace, the satellite sector, is it's not all in Cambridge. The nutraceuticals sector, Aberystwyth is a great hub of plant science. Warwick is a great hub of agri-robotics. The Scottish Central Belt is leading in animal health. Northern Ireland is doing brilliant work in cancer biomarkers. Cornwall has got a big satellite sector. So you see leadership in these new sectors, I think, supports what is taking shape now as this government's industrial strategy, which is around cleaner and healthier growth, more distributed around the country via the Levelling Up programme.
Thank you, George. I think, well, just building on this, Cathryn, you are somebody who has a lot of experience as a regulator, but also as somebody who's leading the Independent Regulatory Horizons Council, which is looking at very similar themes of how we use regulation in a smarter way. What is your assessment of where we are right now and how the context of Brexit has changed the calculus of what we can do with regulation in the future?
Yeah, that's a big question. Thank you, Anton. And I think my experience as a regulator is really just that regulatory reform is hard. And that is not really just because, regulators don't want to change. I don't think that's true, actually. It's more that, regulators as entities, there is a sort of expert culture there that sometimes means that people are quite keen to demonstrate that what they've been doing is the right thing and that they know what they're doing. And the bad version of that is maybe it makes them a little bit less open to change. There's the inevitable sort of path dependencies that you get in any kind of organization. And there's the continual sort of day in, day out pressure that just comes from doing the day job, keeping the wheels turning. And in that context, it is really, really hard for anybody who's working in regulation to kind of raise their eyes above the horizon, think about the future, do a piece of horizon scanning, do a big policy piece on where are we all going in the future and to implement those changes. And I think actually one of the most amazing opportunities that comes from the Brexit debate is, and I think you refer to it in the report, is that it is this fantastic catalyst for thoroughgoing, systemic regulatory reform. And we absolutely need not to waste that, because any impetus to look again at regulation, ask the question, are we focusing on the right objectives? Are we addressing those objectives in the most efficient and effective way? How are we developing, designing and implementing regulatory policy? Any impetus for reflection on that, we should absolutely seize. And as you said, one of the things I'm doing is I'm chairing this body called the Regulatory Horizons Council. And what we're doing there is we're advising policymakers and regulators on what changes to regulatory reform are needed if the UK is to get best value out of technological innovation. And one of the things we've been doing is we've been looking at particular areas of the economy that we think have the potential to deliver significant benefits, where technological change is a big factor, where regulation is a big factor. And we've been looking at some of those areas and looking at what regulatory reform is needed. Now, recently, I think it was this week, we published our report on regulation of fusion energy. We're also looking at genetic technologies and in particular gene editing. We're also looking at unmanned aircraft, and we're looking at medical devices in a post-COVID context. In every single one of those studies, there are significant opportunities that come from Brexit and the release of some of those constraints that we were previously under to think differently. So the whole sort of Brexit debate, if you like, crystallizes in respect of some of the recommendations that will be coming up with in respect of regulatory reform.
Thank you very much, Cathryn, for that context. I suppose one question I would have is, so much of regulation is responding to some kind of need, policy need, and often public need. And especially in areas of new technology and emerging technology, that policy need is not often clear at the outset. How do we go about testing that appetite for different regulation or safer, better regulation? Do you have any suggestions or recommendations from your previous work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about here. I mean, I think, we've got a number of opportunities here. I mean, one is to prioritize differently. So, that might be about thinking about attaching different weight to different objectives. So for example, it is often said, and I think it's borne out in reality, that a lot of the regulation that has historically come from the EU has given a great weight to what we've become used to calling the precautionary principle. And there is a debate that we're having about the relative weight of precaution versus the enablement of innovation. And I think we need to think about what the relative priorities are that we want to attach as a country to those different objectives might be. So we've got an opportunity to think about the priorities there. We've got an opportunity to prioritize regulatory reform in the sectors, in the areas that matter most to the UK. And I've given you some examples of the kind of thing that we're looking at there. And then, as you say in the report, we've got the opportunity then to draw some synergies between other aspects of government policy that might be happening, where actually, if we're going to point in this direction with other bits of government policy, just making sure the regulatory regime is right is absolutely critical. So we can set our different priorities. That's really, really important. But I think more than that, we've got an opportunity to think about what you might call the sort of modalities of regulation and how we do regulation in the UK. And I think part of that is about taking advantage, if you like, of some of the traditions that we've got in the UK that might be slightly different to the traditions that exist in other countries in Europe and across the EU. So one of the things we've been debating a little bit in the Regulatory Horizons Council, for example, is the fact that obviously in the UK, we have a common law approach, we have a precedent-setting regime. Other countries in Europe tend to have regimes that are based more on a sort of Napoleonic legal code. So just the way we do things in the UK perhaps means we have the ability to take a more adaptive, more evolutionary approach to the way that we regulate. That's not a criticism of the way they do things elsewhere, but it is different. So we've got a chance to reflect on that and perhaps to craft a regulatory regime that is more adaptive and evolutionary. I think you pointed out in the report, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we are going to have to grapple with is the increasing nuances in the evolving UK constitution and what that means for how we do regulation here. We're no longer in a position to say, oh, well, if it's coming from the EU, we have to have a single approach across the UK. We are going to have to think about doing things perhaps differently in devolved nations, but also, is there a greater role that we might give to directly elected mayors, to local government and local voices? And I think wrapped up in all of that, and I think this is really important, we have this fantastic opportunity to embrace innovation in the way that we regulate. And I think this goes back to your point about regulation does respond to a need. And I think, we've got a fantastic opportunity, for example, to do things differently in terms of the way we design regulatory policy, the way we implement regulatory policy, which ought to be based much more on, really good quality public engagement. And that's difficult to do, but it's easier if you're doing it in a smaller area, perhaps, where you can make use of certain channels in sort of different ways. So, there's lots of scope there to innovate and do things differently. Can we do more, for example, experimentally? We might be able to experiment more in the real world. We might also be able to do more in terms of digital twins and things like that. And I think, just being able to take those decisions and do things differently in one country is just going to be easier than it would be doing it across a number of countries through a bigger organization. And that I'm really excited about. I think we should really take those opportunities.
Thank you very much, Cathryn. So Jill, turning to you, so far we have an optimistic picture mostly of what we can do with regulation after leaving the EU. You have now co-authored a paper at the IFG, which is looking at that question of managing divergence. There's the paper. What is your view on how the government has engaged with this task so far and what's happening inside Whitehall?
Well, I forced my colleague Jo Marshall, and Anton, it's lovely to be back doing something with you, former IFG colleague. I forced Jo Marshall to put out a quote, which has to be said he's too young to understand, which was that that the government was approaching this a bit like a game of Space Invaders played blindfold. So distressed that my IFG colleagues are so young, they didn't know what Space Invaders was, but Jo spent yesterday watching Space Invaders videos. Because at the moment, what you get the sense is very much coming up from individual departments where they're spotting issues and thinking we could do something there. And a bit of it's just more motivated by showing we can do something differently than any sort of underlying philosophy. And that's why I think actually the point George was making about the TIGGR report saying we actually need to think, what is the plan? What is the philosophy? What do we want to do differently? Is a sensible starting point. I'm going to leave it to my gloomy UK and a Changing Europe colleague, Cathryn Barnard, to tell you all the potential constraints on our new regulatory freedom. But I just, what I really want to say is I think the government needs to get two things, and so do the opposition to it. One, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that you think on balance, Brexit was not what you chose, was a mistake, but to say that actually the EU regulating for 28 countries in a sort of slow way, which has pluses, but also, as Cathryn was saying, has some minuses, finds it very difficult to change outdated regulation based on, old evidence and things like that. It's very unnimble. It has its big plus when it does it for a lot of countries, but it's quite hard. It's a long process. We know that directives lie around for really a long time. And sometimes they look quite lowest common denominator-ish when you've been through the commission, working groups, the council, co-decision with the parliament, then they come back. And I think it's perfect reason to say on balance, Brexit may have been the wrong choice, but actually there are areas where we could do things that better suit UK circumstances, preferences, needs, relative economic strengths and things like that than something that's done done to fit the interests of the 28. Equally, I think the government should be prepared to acknowledge that there are quite a lot of areas where even if we could do things a bit differently from the EU, actually there are some quite significant costs that bring internally in terms of divergence within the UK internal market, where Scotland and Wales made it clear that they actually broadly are probably going to stay more aligned with the EU. But certainly with Northern Ireland, which is obliged through the protocol that the UK government signed up to stay aligned with quite a batch of EU regulations, that actually there's quite a lot of areas where actually the smart thing for UK to do and for UK businesses is not just not to diverge from EU regulation, but actually in some areas to keep pace with changes in EU regulations. And I think we need to move this debate onto the substance of what actually are the benefits of changes and the potential costs, from a debate about, is this showing and being able to have another notch on the bedpost of a Brexit dividend versus another sort of battle over there. One of the things that I've most despaired about when you dare suggest any of this is I don't think that doing things differently necessarily means lower standards. It can mean different standards, and probably should mean different standards. I also, during the course of the Brexit debate, found it profoundly depressing that a lot of UK lobby groups and interest groups thought the only way to continue to protect workers' rights, to continue to protect the environment, was for the EU to force it on us, or for us to oblige ourselves to do that through our long-run trading agreement. Cathryn will talk about the constraints we did end up signing up to, and non-regression, things like that, I'm sure. But actually, that's a debate we ought to have domestically. We ought to be able to decide, is that actually how we want to protect workers? Are we actually valuing really the right things in the way we protect workers, and maybe missing out something, because the UK has quite a different labour market to other labour markets? So my hope from Brexit, and this will make me sound like a Brexit supporter, my hope from Brexit is that we can actually have a much more grown-up debate about regulation in the UK, where we don't get this situation where the UK actually was quite influential in shaping regulation in Brussels. We have to accept that without the UK influence, we actually will probably like quite a lot of the regulation coming out of the EU less than we would have done if we'd still been a significant voice at the table. That is one of the downsides of no longer being there. But that we can actually do it where we say, actually, what suits UK needs, what suits the interests of UK business, what meets our preferences. And then the best bit about Brexit is when there's a new regulation, we will no longer have ministers saying, well, basically, I was forced to sign up to this. I went and battled hard, but you know what it's like over in Europe. And oh, there's a Telegraph column by one Boris Johnson saying it's rubbish. Anyway, yeah, I agree with all that, but you can't trust insert French, Germans, or whatever. To actually have a debate domestically about that and take responsibility. One of the things that's always got me about debates on regulation is red tape challenge after red tape challenge focuses only on one side of the equation, which is the costs of regulation. There are loads of costs of regulation, but governments are not fundamentally moronic. Governments do regulate because they think the benefits outweigh the costs. The big task is to make sure that you do regulation in a way that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the costs. But you must never, never, never just focus on the costs of regulation. You want to actually answer the question, this is what we see as the benefits. Are we actually delivering those benefits in the most cost-efficient way? And are they still worth doing? And if we can get to a place where we can do that and factor in, as our report says, all these things, we've lost the EU straitjacket. But what we're now doing when we think about regulation is we're playing a game of multidimensional chess, where we've got to have in our mind, what does it mean for the relations within the Union? What does it mean for our TCA obligations? What does it mean for Northern Ireland? Is it still worth it? Are we doing it smartly and as well as we can? As George says, there'll be some sectors where the figures just stack up, that we should do things very differently. Others where actually, let's just stay in a sort of EU-ish pack. It's our biggest market for a lot of our businesses. They're very exposed to EU trade. And the last thing they want after the last few years is to face different regulatory regimes for the sake of having different regimes, which bring very little in terms of benefits, but double up their costs.
Thank you, Jill. And I suppose it prompts the question, is the government equipped to play that multidimensional chess right now? And you've sketched out some of the recommendations in your paper which focus on how the government should get its house in order to be able to do that. Can you just tell us a little bit more about those?
I think it needs to have a much more sort of coordinated approach. It's very easy. I mean, the way we've done regulation in the past is that the ideas come up from departments. They're then forced to jump a series of hurdles through things like the Regulatory Policy Committee, a bit of challenge, maybe a cabinet committee. This is not a particular criticism of Conservative governments or the coalition government. This was true under the Labour government as well. We've had sort of slightly, rules like 1 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out. Frankly, when I was at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, we had a stack of regulations that we could get rid of, and we probably ought to get rid of, but we kept them in the pending tray so that when we had some regulatory move we wanted to do, we had one we could throw on the bonfire to meet the compliance constraints. George, it was before your time, George. I'm sure you were never so cynical. But we knew we had to get through these hoops. So it's a bit like an obstacle course or whatever. I think it's very good if the TIGRR report actually provokes debate about saying, actually, what is our big regulatory strategy to use this new freedom? Because what we've seen is a combination of 4 years of Brexit plus 1 year of COVID means that there is actually not enough, capacity really to be thinking very strategically in government. And I think that's what we really need. The government's got big other agendas as well it wants to do. So I would say, don't rush at this. Actually look and say, where actually is it worth investing the time, effort and capacity in getting this right? And as George says, some of the very big wins comes when we do it so right that the UK then, at the margin starts a London effect to substitute for the Brussels effect that we all talk about. Brussels effect is based on size of market. We don't have that. So we need a different source of comparative advantage in regulating, which is actually being much better at incorporating in science, innovative and flexible approaches to regulation that don't have to fit the needs of 27 very different member states, and actually can sort of start setting the bar. And everybody says, well, actually, it's a Blue Peter approach to regulation. There's one the Brits designed earlier. Let's just import that one. It looks pretty sensible to us. And then we've given our manufacturers already meeting that standard a head start over other countries who will then have to adapt to ours. That's the dream. We may not be able to do it in very many sectors. It'd be good to identify a few. I think the Treasury is already thinking about that in financial services, effectively de facto giving up on equivalence, I think, even though they haven't said that in terms. But I think there are other sectors where we ought to be thinking. But I think those will be relatively few, and that's where we should be deploying our efforts.
Thank you very much, Jill. Cathryn, now moving on to you. What do you think are some of the constraints that the government has to navigate as it tries to pursue some of the positive changes and reforms that we've been talking about? You have been writing about the EU single market evolution for a long, long time, have followed the UK's influence in that development. How do you see that as a continuation of a longer trend, perhaps?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me here. And I think what's been very interesting about the debate so far is that the debate is about regulation and not deregulation. It's about better regulation in areas that we're good at, rather than what some people appear to be talking about, which is full-blown deregulation. And even if you wanted to aim for full-blown deregulation and that very narrow view of free trade, there are considerable constraints. And so I think there are 5, it depends on how you count, I'm sure others would come up with some different ones. But first and foremost is, of course, our commitments, first of all, under the WTO. And the WTO absolutely envisages that states will have regulations and will want to protect their markets when standards of goods or products coming from other states do not comply with the standards they expect. And so WTO law does, in principle, allow host states to impose standards. So we are not talking about a full-scale deregulatory model. And if you're not talking about the WTO, you are also talking about other international standard setting bodies. There's some highly technical ones on about producing electromagnetic type products, all of which are laid down in international standards, which for us have been translated via the EU and then into UK law. But even when you lose the EU level, still we will subscribe to those standards. So those are in the international plane. And then of course the third issue on the international plane is what constraints are imposed by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the agreement which was concluded just before Christmas. And there, of course, the constraints are not so great because that was a decision that was taken in negotiating the TCA, but nevertheless, there is a price to pay if we do decide to significantly deregulate. It's not that the TCA precludes us from doing it, but there is a price to pay, and the price to pay will ultimately be tariffs. And the particular areas where there will be a price to pay if we decide to deregulate will be in the field of environmental law and employment law, but also we know that the rebalancing mechanism also kicks in other areas too. So there is already these international constraints, but I think the domestic related constraints are significant too. And when I'm talking about the domestic related constraints, I'm thinking about the constraints that you find in respect to the devolved administrations. So in respect of Scotland, we know that the Continuity Act has been agreed in respect of future EU legislation, which Scotland says it wants to maintain alignment with. And this already will create difficulties in respect of the operation of the Internal Market Act. And crudely speaking, the Internal Market Act says that goods which have been lawfully produced under English law, to put it crudely, can be sold in Scotland. And there are very limited ways that Scotland can resist the importation of goods produced in accordance with English law. And of course, if you are a manufacturer, you know your market in England is much bigger than the market in Scotland. So you cut your cloth in accordance with the requirements of the English market. The other major constraint is, of course, the effect of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, that is a commitment, international commitment under the withdrawal agreement. And while, of course, the content of the Northern Ireland Protocol is well known, it applies to goods and it applies in respect of all of those areas listed in the annex to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is absolutely substantial. But remember, it's not just about goods. It also extends to quite a lot of EU social legislation and equality legislation, and possibly goes even further than that. And I get all of that from Article 2 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, if I can just pause for a moment on the Northern Ireland Protocol, again, at least formally, we are free to depart from the Northern Ireland Protocol, and there are serious consequences that will follow, but of course it's not an absolute prohibition, but in principle, so long as we want to respect our international obligations, particularly in the highly sensitive area of Northern Ireland, then I will assume that we will not want to deliberately breach the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol if we can avoid doing so. Now, on the Northern Ireland Protocol, I think what's rather interesting is to have a look, and this will confirm all of your suspicions about lawyers, at section 8C1 of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement, Withdrawal Act 2018. And I can see George Freeman ready to throw himself already under a bus at just the mention of this provision. But that's the provision which essentially gives ministers powers to ensure that we comply with EU legislation in respect of Northern Ireland. And last night I went through all of the legislation which has been adopted in 2021, all the statutory instruments adopted under this provision. And one thing that really struck me, there weren't that many, but one of the regulations on fertilizers and ammonium nitrate material, George is nodding as if he knows all about this regulation, but it does give powers to ministers not only to give effect to the EU obligations, but also gives powers to ministers to extend those obligations to Great Britain as well. And what's striking is that although we've lost Section 2.2 of the European Communities Act, which was the conduit pipe for enabling statutory instruments to be used to implement EU directives, what seems to be happening, only on the basis of this one regulation, is to give ministers powers to allow for alignment in respect of Great Britain with those EU rules. Now, this is fertilisers. I know absolutely nothing about fertilisers, but this may be an area which is absolutely quite sensible for the UK to align, because this is not one of the areas that George has been talking about. So that was what I wanted to say about constraints. And of course, the other constraints that have already been mentioned by others, which I won't go into, are, of course, the Brussels effect, that there are key areas where manufacturers do not want to have the alignment. If you're talking about widgets in light bulbs in car headlights, the idea of de-aligning just for the sake of de-alignment makes very little sense. It goes back to Jill's point about the costs versus the benefits, and don't just de-align for the sake of showing and saying that we can de-align. The one other point I would like to make, and then I'll stop, is that you talk, Anton, in your paper about passive divergence. And of course, that's already happening. Again, because I haven't got a life, I had a look to see how many directives and EU regulations have been adopted since January, so in the 6 months since we left. And I can tell you from a search on Eurolex last night that 8 directives have been adopted by the EU since January. Now, those directives will have a time period for implementation, so they won't bite straight away. But there have been 419 EU regulations that have been adopted. Now, that may well confirm those who supported Brexit fears that the EU seems to have regulatory desire beyond any belief that they just want to regulate for the sake of regulation. But the fact is that regulations, as you know, and I use regulations in the technical EU sense of being a rule that automatically part of the domestic legal system. There have been 419 of them. Of course, they will not be part of the UK's legal system, except in those areas which will affect Northern Ireland. So you could say this is regulatory diarrhea by the EU, or you could say that passive divergence has already occurred. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cathryn. And I see a question in the chat from Tim Lord, who has asked about how the single market might change after the UK has now left the EU. And that will, of course, have an impact on the level and the extent of divergence. Where do you expect some of the major changes to the way that the single market is regulated in the years ahead? And also, how do you think the UK's departure from the single market might change what is happening within the EU?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
So, and I was multitasking, which is not good. I was looking at the questions that come in. So your question is specifically
about the evolution of the single market and how it will change after Brexit.
So, I mean, the interesting question is whether the EU will become more protectionist in time, because it hasn't got the UK countervailing weight. And I think the answer to that is probably yes. But again, I use those terms with a degree of caution because it's very easy to make sweeping statements. What we are seeing, and this is where I think it's very easy to stereotype the EU to say EU is clunky and bad at regulating, and therefore states are good and not clunky, because I don't think it's as binary as that. EU legislation can be more nimble than the stereotype indicates, not least because a lot of EU regulation makes space for secondary or tertiary regulation to allow rather speedy adaptation over very technical matters about changes of products that can be included in cosmetics, that sort of thing. The big emphasis, of course, now is the digital single market and also the cross-border selling. And I think this is something that the EU is doing quite fast and quite well. And this is something that we are going to have to think about very hard, because we are losing access to that. So a recognition that if I'm producing goods in Belgium, I want to be able to sell them in Slovakia, and I want to be able to quickly get my money back if the purchaser in Slovakia doesn't pay me for those goods. And I really don't want to have to engage with the Slovakian legal system over 10, 15 euros worth of goods. So it's actually that aspect of what the EU is doing now is interesting and also rather experimental. And one of the reasons it must be said for the Brussels effect is because the fact is that some of the EU legislation is considered to be very good. So I realise this is not popular narrative, but I think we've got to be more nuanced than just saying everything that comes out of Brussels is bad and everything that comes out of the UK is good. The one point I think George was going to make earlier, and perhaps ran out of time, is that of course in areas where we are innovative, those new areas that Cathryn and George have been talking about, it may be the case that it acts as a catalyst for the EU to compete with us and produce quality legislation which is better for us all, because if the EU competes with us and does a better job than we do, then of course we respond to that. So there is some regulatory competition that might result from all of this. But I would also agree, I think, with the thrust of what all the speakers have been saying, is that it would be absolutely crazy just to have our own rules on widgets for bulbs and car headlights just for the sake of making them different, because for manufacturers it will just become impossible.
Thank you very much, Cathryn. I see we have a question about the Brussels effect, and that question is asking exactly what we've been talking about, which is, can the UK realistically escape the Brussels effect, given how dependent it is on some of the EU markets, especially in the manufacturing sectors, that is. And it also mentions AI. And Cathryn, Ross, this might be a question to you now. There was a proposal for regulation recently from the EU on artificial intelligence. I suppose it might be a good example of how the Brussels effect might play out in the future. Do you have any views on how we should take account of some of those effects as we design or change our regulations going forward?
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of points I'd make on that. I mean, the first is, I mean, I very much agree with the thrust of the discussion so far, which is, and I think this is what you're saying in your paper, we've got to be pragmatic about this. We've got to get regulation in the UK that works, that is a proportionate response to risk, and that weighs up the opportunity that British-based firms will still value in terms of trading with the EU. So we have to be pragmatic about that. And it's a big market. And so, yes, I think the thrust of the questioner's point, which is that, can we escape the fact that we have a big market that is relatively close to us, that has a particular regulatory regime, which might therefore create commercial advantage and a degree of harmonization with that regime? No, I don't think we can escape that. I don't think we should try and escape that. That's reality. And that's true for all sorts of regulation, be it related to technological innovation or what. But it's not the only market. And if we're talking about diverging from the EU, then actually, there is a question not only about whether that means that the UK can go it alone, quote unquote, but about whether there are other markets with other regimes that we might also think about aligning with, precisely to get similar sorts of commercial benefits. The EU is not the only big market. So I think we shouldn't just always look to the EU and the benefits of accessing a big market through some degree of regulatory convergence with them, but to other markets as well. Another point that I just wanted to make on this, because it's something that we hear a lot. Okay, so as the Regulatory Horizons Council, we've been going around talking to people who are having ideas, trying to get those ideas into startup, to get those startups into commercial scale. And we've been talking to them about what they think about regulation. And it's absolutely clear, just picking up on the points that Jill and Cathryn have been making, it's absolutely clear that those people do not necessarily always and everywhere want to see a drive towards deregulation. You say to people who are involved in the commercialization of these sorts of innovations, what do you need to make this work? And often what they're saying to us is they need the right regulatory regimes that will enable their innovation to be taken up in an atmosphere of trust. And they see that regulation is a really, really important part to play in that. What they do need is clarity about what that regulation is. They need to be able to access that easily. They need to understand what it means for their business. And I think one of the points which is really critical when we're talking about Brexit as a catalyst for change is, sudden change is bad. Unpredictable change is bad. So if we are going to be diverging from EU type regulation, then what we do need is clarity on purpose. So why are we doing this? Ideally, some enduring principles that people can use to help them navigate through the change that is about to happen. And for preference, a clear roadmap that helps them to navigate through that change. So I think with all of this, we need to be thoughtful on how we manage a process of change in a way that is favourable to business.
Thank you, Cathryn. I think it goes back to what George was saying about the need for a roadmap and some of the implementation strategy. George, just to prompt you on this point, do you think the Prime Minister has a roadmap or is thinking about a roadmap? And what do you think are going to be the next steps? It seems like a Wild West right now. A lot of things are staying the same, some things are changing. Nobody really knows what is going to happen when. What do you what should we expect from the months ahead?
Yeah, well, just on that, that's precisely why he asked us to do this piece of work. I mean, to be fair, the country was, wheel spinning. Brexit was locking us all in a most horrific mess. And it's only a year ago that the election gave a clear mandate, and then we went straight into the COVID emergency. So, in January, Christmas, the PM asked me if I would help work on this. So I think, to be fair, he and the government recognise we absolutely need a roadmap, and this is the beginning of that process. And certainly my steer, which echoes everything that Cathryn and Jill have said, is, industry doesn't invest on the basis of a soundbite, a press release, or a kind of a 3-month window. It invests on 5 to 10 year windows, and clarity and strategic intent that's fixed and is set out as a kind of lit runway for what we're really doing is absolutely key if we're going to drive the recovery that we need. I mean, we're now facing levels of debt not seen since 1760, and the combination of the crash, COVID, and the Brexit slowdown means this is urgent. We have to get growth, and part of my ambition in this project is you only get British growth up to 3, 4, 5% to escape the next generation from debt if you're home to some sectors growing at 100%. And we will not deliver the growth we need in a sustainable way by carrying on with the old model. So, this isn't a sort of luxury debate that we could choose not to have. We have got to find ways of getting out of debt that are sustainable. And I think leadership in the new sectors of agri-tech, of smart medicines, of all the things we've listed in the TIGRR report are part of that. I think there's just 2 or 3 points from the discussion, which has been really brilliant. And I really echo the point Jill made, that finally we're now talking about, I think all speakers have made it, that it's really important that for too long, ministers of all parties have just blamed Europe. It's the easiest game. Oh yeah, we lost the debate. There's no hiding place now. Ministers in the UK are going to be accountable, and I relish that. And it's a higher bar, it's a discipline, and part of our report sets out that Parliament is going to have to, guess what, actually take statutory instruments really seriously and not make statutory instrument committees the kind of the whip's punishment. We want to make it a process where this is your chance as a backbench MP on a committee on a Friday or Thursday afternoon to actually help shape legislation for our country. And I welcome that if that's part of what this does. 2 more points. The Brussels effect cuts both ways, by the way. For big companies, the lobbying in Brussels, the chance to shape legislation and regulation to suit big companies is an effect. And in my sectors, I mean, I came to Parliament after a career with little companies trying to break into markets and take on the big, comfortable companies. The Brussels legislative effect. Small companies don't even get a look in. You need to employ a team of PR people in Brussels. So there is a Brussels effect, which is, it does tend to entrench the voices of the big established businesses. By the way, that's a problem in the UK as well. We don't get enough insurgent voices into Whitehall. One of the things we've done through the TIGRR roundtables is bring the little companies, the innovators in. So it cuts both ways. But the serious point about the Brussels effect does need to be tackled. So in nowhere is it more powerful, I think, than in the life science sector, which I was minister for. I mean, nobody wants to suggest that we have a different medicines regulatory framework for every single country. That would be bonkers. I've just had my second vaccination, and I would not want a vaccination developed by an unregulated medicine sector. None of us would. And so I mean, nobody, I think when you see the TIGGR report, you will be relieved that this is not some sort of dash to the bottom. There's nothing in there about removing employment rights, about that kind of, sort of race to the bottom narrative that we've heard talked about. So in the life sciences, there is a real challenge. If we're leaving the European single market, then we had better have a compelling alternative proposition for the UK. Basically, the last 30 years, we've been the English-speaking, entrepreneurial, and in life sciences, very influential shaper of the European Medicines Agency regulatory process. And our argument in the report is the pace of genomics and informatics is totally changing the way drugs are being developed. It's changing the way in which they're being assessed and licensed and regulated and reimbursed. We're moving from a world where the industry creates a one-size-fits-all blockbuster medicine, 80% of which fail in development, and the ones that get through are then very expensive to recoup the costs. And you then have a single negotiation on price. We're moving to a world where the industry can begin to develop drugs for particular patient subcohorts, genetically profiled using their own data. Charities are now setting up not-for-profit companies to work with industry to create drugs for them. This is empowering patient groups that have been left behind. Big pharma tends to focus on the big established markets, not the rare diseases. This is a brilliant, brilliant revolution. And the EU is a long way away behind on it. So the UK, what we've set out is the UK should be really accelerating our leadership in genomics, in informatics, in accelerated access, in using our NHS research base to help create fast track test beds for new medicines and generate the data. And actually, the old days of a device, a diagnostic, a drug, all being regulated differently are converging. We're now seeing digital drugs that give a digital signal on their own bioabsorption. So regulating now, you can't regulate in silos. So we have a real opportunity and we need to grip it. I think if we get this right, in 5 or 6 years, the EMA will be coming back to London and saying, God, look what the Brits have done. They've really lent in and they're now developing best practice. And that's what we need to do, because if we don't come up with some compelling offer, I think you'll see a lot of global pharma will start to focus on the European single market, single procurement, and the UK will lose out. And we have got to have something to compensate for that.
Thank you, George. It feels like a good note to end this discussion, which has been wide-ranging and fascinating. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. This is a massive subject and we could be talking about it for hours and hours, and I would encourage you all to go to our website and see the report and let us know what you think. We hope this is a beginning of a much, much bigger conversation, which we can start with others like the IFG and the Taskforce and all the important players in the space. But I would like to thank our panel, Jill, George, Cathryn. Cathryn, thank you so much for joining us today on a Friday afternoon and for sharing your wisdom and insights. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you and have a lovely afternoon all.